to sort out the mess that he left behind. But maybe he, one day, perhaps we'll have to wait for his memoirs, could account for his role in the most disastrous decision of all, which is the illegal invasion of Iraq.
The chairman of the Iraq inquiry has said he's disappointed that Britain's top civil servant has refused to authorise publication of notes sent by Tony Blair to President George Bush in the run-up to war. Sir John Chilcot has said the documents are central to an understanding of when and how the former Prime Minister made commitments to the US about military involvement.
I find that for almost the whole of the period up to Baha Musa's death on the evening of the 15th of September, the detainees were kept handcuffed, hooded, and in stress positions in extreme heat and conditions of some squalor. I find that from the outset of their incarceration in the TDF, the detainees were subjected to assaults by those who were guarding them, and in particular by pain.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
That you, along with President Bush, top administration officials, made a total of 935 false public statements in an orchestrated attempt to take this nation to war. Here's a stack of these false statements right here, all 935 of them. This study has found that you, Madam Secretary, made 56 false statements to the American people, where you repeatedly pump up the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and exaggerate the so-called relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Madam Secretary, can you please tell us, isn't it true that you had intelligence that cast doubt on your repeated claims?
Persuading the nation to go to war with Iraq was a tortuous process for Tony Blair. Given what we know now, proving that what he did wasn't an unforgivable sin looks a lot harder. With his appearance at the Chilcot inquiry looming, though, he's trying to lay the grounds, suggesting weapons of mass destruction, the official justification, weren't really the point.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
Despite previously being adamant it wasn't a reason for going to war in Iraq, the federal government now says oil is one of the reasons Australian troops are staying there. Launching the government's latest defence update, the Prime Minister says energy security, including oil, is something Australians need to think about when considering the consequences.
Fast forward again to August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq, but polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed, An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem: there never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people who participated in a conspiracy. Yes, an out-and-out conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation. So, if a new man named Bush is in the White House and helps engineer a brazen deception in order to achieve global geopolitical goals as well as domestic and personal ones, it wouldn't be a first, would it?
It was the most critical meeting in the tense weeks before the Iraq War. Face-to-face talks in the White House between President Bush and Tony Blair, along with their most senior officials. Channel 4 News has seen a secret memo which details that discussion between the two leaders. The President makes it clear there'll be war on Saddam regardless of whether the UN passes a further resolution. The Prime Minister replies he is, quotes, solidly with the President. And George Bush even floats the idea of trying to lure Saddam into war by flying an American spy plane over Iraq painted in UN colours. The details are contained in a new version of the book Lawless World by the leading international lawyer Philippe Sands, QC. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this exclusive report.
January 31st, 2003. Tony Blair is heading to the White House. This would be one of the most critical meetings in the build-up to war. France, Germany, Russia and many in Britain wanted the UN inspections in Iraq to have more time. Saddam Hussein had made what he called a full declaration of his past chemical and biological weaponry. But with forces mounting on Iraq's border, Tony Blair knew war was almost certainly not far off. He wanted the world to unite against Saddam. He wanted the US to back a second resolution at the United Nations. But there had been no smoking gun found in Iraq to turn round world opinion, and both leaders knew it.
Channel 4 News has seen a memo of the White House meeting which records that critical summit. The memo paints a picture of two leaders intensely aware that even though they think Saddam Hussein has done enough to justify war, much of the world is disagreeing and angry. The White House meeting memo conveys an air of desperation as the two leaders cast around for how world opinion might be turned.
The White House meeting memo says President Bush told Mr. Blair the US was thinking of flying U-2 reconnaissance aircraft with fighter cover over Iraq, painted in UN colours. If Saddam fired on them, he would be in breach. The US had in the past flown spy planes over Iraq. It had flown them in the colours and service of the UN, but a senior UN source told us they were perfectly capable of flying above the range of Iraqi missiles, and the fighter escorts and talk of Saddam firing on them suggests to some that the US was almost willing Saddam to strike out at the plane.
I think the context is clear that by January 2003 it appears that the British Prime Minister and the US President were conscious that they had no evidence of their own, that it was increasingly likely that Hans Blix would not come up with the big smoking gun that Jack Straw wanted, and that they would therefore have to procure a material breach through some other means. And I think against that background it's very hard to find a charitable explanation for this type of discussion between the heads of these two countries.
We've gone through all senior people in the administration, the papers preparing for such a meeting. And it means that at senior levels in the US administration, crazy, illegal, deceitful proposals like that were actually being contemplated to trigger a war by deceit.
We just had a wide-ranging discussion on a lot of issues.
A new book by the international lawyer Philippe Sands makes clear that Mr. Blair at this meeting also heard the President suggest there might be other ways of altering the course of events. The book gives details of the White House meeting memo, in which President Bush says it was also possible that a defector could be brought out who would give a public presentation about Saddam's WMD. And there was also a small possibility that Saddam would be assassinated.
But Mr. Blair doesn't seem to be too optimistic about those possibilities, and he pursues the main reason for his trip to the US. He wants President Bush to throw his weight behind an attempt to get a second UN resolution authorising war. Mr. Blair's been advised he needs it to have a hope of getting parliamentary backing for war. President Bush is being advised by much of his top team not to go near the United Nations again.
According to the White House meeting memo, the Prime Minister said that a second Security Council resolution would provide an insurance policy against the unexpected and international cover, including with the Arabs.
What is important is that the international community comes together again and makes...
President Bush would later refer to this two-hour meeting as the famous second resolution meeting. He did agree, against the advice of many in his administration, to give the UN another try. But he also made it clear that even if there was no second UN resolution, war would happen, and soon. The White House meeting memo, seen by Channel 4 News outside the UK, records that President Bush said the US would put its full weight behind efforts to get another resolution and would twist arms and even threaten. But he had to say that if ultimately we failed, military action would follow anyway. Tony Blair responds that he is solidly with the President and ready to do whatever it took to disarm Saddam. Just before the meeting with President Bush, Mr. Blair gave a round of interviews at the British Embassy in Washington. He was asked, was there already a date in the diary for war?
Well, no, there's not a specific deadline that we have alighted upon.
But later, at the White House meeting, Mr. Blair learnt there was a specific date President Bush had in mind, the 10th of March. The window for winning round the rest of the world to a new UN resolution was tight and pretty much immovable. War actually began on March the 20th.
Joining the President at the meeting were his then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, her deputy Dan Fried, and the Chief of Staff for the White House Andrew Card. The Prime Minister took along his then Security Advisor David Manning, along with his then Foreign Policy aide Matthew Rycroft, and his Chief of Staff Jonathan Powell. The whole tone of the White House meeting seems to be two leaders who don't feel they have enough evidence of a breach to convince the world. But their own position is that Saddam is already in breach because of lack of cooperation with inspectors. But that doesn't appear to be the view of the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, according to a private letter he sent Tony Blair in early January 2003, reported in a new book by the international lawyer Philippe Sands.
Mr. Straw's note seems to indicate his belief that as of January 2003, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was not in material breach. And of course, if Saddam Hussein's Iraq was not in material breach at the beginning of January 2003, nothing happened after that date to bring him into material breach, and it means that the entire argument of material breach unravels.
Back at the 30th January meeting, President Bush told the Prime Minister he didn't expect Iraq to erupt in violence after its liberation. President Bush told Mr. Blair he thought it unlikely that there would be internecine warfare between the different religious and ethnic groups. British journalists accompanying the Prime Minister were given a document supposed to strengthen the case for war, but a chunk of it turned out to be lifted off the internet. It would become known as the dodgy dossier. The Prime Minister was running out of time to win round opinion, and in Washington and London some of the attempts to turn things round were looking increasingly ragged and desperate.
And I tried hard to be proud of my service, but all I could feel was shame. And racism could no longer mask the reality of the occupation. These were people, these were human beings. I've since been plagued by guilt anytime I see an elderly man, like the one who couldn't walk, who we rolled onto a stretcher and told the Iraqi police to take him away. I feel guilt anytime I see a mother with her children, like the one who cried hysterically and screamed that we are worse than Saddam as we forced her from her home. I feel guilt anytime I see a young girl, like the one I grabbed by the arm and dragged into the street. We were told we were fighting terrorists. The real terrorist was me, and the real terrorism is this occupation. Racism within the military has long been an important tool to justify the destruction and occupation of another country. It has long been used to justify the killing, subjugation, and torture of another people. Racism is a vital weapon employed by this government. It is a more important weapon than a rifle, a tank, a bomber, or a battleship. It is more destructive than an artillery shell, or a bunker buster, or a Tomahawk missile. While all those weapons are created and owned by this government, they are harmless without people willing to use them. Those who send us to war do not have to pull a trigger or lob a mortar round. They do not have to fight the war, they merely have to sell the war. They need a public who is willing to send their soldiers into harm's way. They need soldiers who are willing to kill and be killed without question. They can spend millions on a single bomb, but that bomb only becomes a weapon when the ranks of the military are willing to follow orders to use it. They can send every last soldier anywhere on earth, but there will only be a war if soldiers are willing to fight. And the ruling class, the billionaires who profit from human suffering, care only about expanding their wealth, controlling the world economy. Understand that their power lies only in their ability to convince us that war, oppression, and exploitation is in our interest. They understand that their wealth is dependent on their ability to convince the working class to die to control the market of another country. And convincing us to kill and die is based on their ability to make us think that we are somehow superior. Soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen have nothing to gain from this occupation. The vast majority of people living in the U.S. have nothing to gain from this occupation. In fact, not only do we have nothing to gain, but we suffer more because of it. We lose limbs, endure trauma, and give our lives. Our families have to watch flag-draped coffins lowered into the earth. Millions in this country without health care, jobs, or access to education must watch this government squander over $450 million a day on this occupation. Poor and working people in this country are sent to kill poor and working people in another country to make the rich richer. And without racism, soldiers would realize that they have more in common with the Iraqi people than they do with the billionaires who send us to war. I threw families onto the street in Iraq, only to come home and find families thrown onto the street in this country, in this tragic and unnecessary foreclosure crisis. We need to wake up and realize that our real enemies are not in some distant land. They're not people whose names we don't know and cultures we don't understand. The enemy is people we know very well and people we can identify. The enemy is a system that wages war when it's profitable. The enemy is the CEOs who lay us off from our jobs when it's profitable. It's the insurance companies who deny us health care when it's profitable. It's the banks who take away our homes when it's profitable. Our enemy is not 5,000 miles away. They are right here at home. If we organize and fight with our sisters and brothers, we can stop this war, we can stop this government, and we can create a better world.
On the 7th of July 2005, London was hit by a series of explosions. You probably think you know what happened that morning, but you don't. This film is an attempt to refute the central conspiracy theory regarding the event, a conspiracy theory presented to us by the police, the government, and the media, because that is all the official story is, a conspiracy theory. In case you don't know it, here it is. On the morning of the 7th, 3 British-born men drove down from Leeds to meet a 4th man at Luton train station. In the station car park, they loaded backpacks with homemade explosives they'd spent the last few months making in a bomb factory outside Leeds. They entered the station at 7:22 a.m. and boarded the 7:40 train to London, which arrived at King's Cross at 8:23 a.m. They then made the short walk to the underground station, where, at around 8:30 a.m, they split up and each headed off to separate trains. 3 of the men blew themselves up almost simultaneously at 8:50 a.m. The 4th, Hasib Hussain, apparently unable to board a train, left the underground, bought a battery in W.H. Smith, briefly visited McDonald's, then got on a number 30 bus and triggered his bomb at 9:47 a.m. This is the official story, and after a year of media dissemination, it has been planted securely in all our minds. But the official story is wrong. The events of 7/7 did not happen the way they've been described. This is not merely a question of interpretation, it is a fact. Hypothesis has been presented as truth. Speculation has been offered as certainty. There are unexplained discrepancies, inexplicable contradictions, and unanswered questions in the official story. What the British public has been presented is, in fact, a complex but contradictory series of lies. One thing that is clear is the terrible loss of life. And yet, despite demands from the Muslim community, the families of the victims and the victim support group, Tony Blair and the Labour government have obstinately rejected calls for a full, independent public inquiry into the attacks. What reasons have they given? We've been told an inquiry would prejudice the current investigation. We've been told an inquiry would prevent the police and government from focusing on future attacks. And we've been told an inquiry would take too much time, cost too much money, and divert resources away from the war on terrorism. Criteria our government unfortunately chose not to apply when deciding to illegally invade Iraq. And we've been told by the Prime Minister himself that a public inquiry would be a ludicrous diversion. Instead, we were offered a narrative to be written by the civil service based entirely on whatever information the police and security services chose to provide them. Tony Blair assured us that all our questions would be answered by this narrative. On December the 14th, he said, "I do accept that the people want to know exactly what happened, and we will make sure that they do." And he said, "We will publish a full account of all the information we have." And he pledged, "We will bring together all the evidence that we have and publish it, so that the people, the victims and others, can see exactly what happened." Well, Tony, the narrative has now been published. It does not tell us exactly what happened. It is not a full account of all the information you have, and it certainly is not all the evidence. So did you mean what you said? Or were those promises just more politically expedient lies? Let's take a look at the official narrative released by the Home Office on May the 11th, 2006. One thing that's immediately clear is that the author has not seen the raw source material for much of the evidence he cites. What we're being offered is at best second-hand information, at worst deceptive hearsay. Although the mainstream media have strangely refused to properly analyse the contents of the narrative, most of the issues raised by this document have been covered efficiently by the alternative media, so we will not go into detail about the items of interest that the narrative glosses over, or conveniently does not mention at all. Like the fact that identifying documentation for Mohammed Sadiq Khan was, for some reason, found at 3 out of the 4 bomb sites, or the issue of what explosives were used, something that, incredibly, is described in the narrative as still under expert examination more than a year after the attacks, or the fake Al-Qaeda confession, released on the internet a few hours after the attacks through a server in Texas, or the training exercises taking place in London that day, based on a scenario of bombs going off at the exact same times at the exact same stations as the attacks occurred.
So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real.
Or the huge amount of money made in speculating the rise and fall of sterling, the result of either full knowledge of the event or extraordinary luck. Or the arrest of Haroon Aswat, widely reported by the UK media as being the mastermind behind the attacks, and by the US media as being an agent for MI5. or the strange mistake regarding the time of the train taken by the men from Luton that morning. The police, the press and the government narrative all reported that the men took the 7:40 departure, but as discovered by bloggers in the alternative media, the 7:40 was cancelled that day. Instead, we will focus on the list of key evidence specifically cited in the narrative. DNA identified the 4 at separate bomb sites, and damage to bodies suggests they were close to bombs. 3 of the men have been forensically linked to the bomb factory in Leeds. The car in which they travelled contained explosive devices. The 4 were identified on CCTV at various points on their journey. Witness accounts suggest 2 of the men were fiddling in their rucksacks. There is no evidence of remote detonation at the bomb sites. There is a video statement by Khan. Khan also left a last will and testament indicating his desire to martyr himself. Let's go through these in reverse. Like most of the evidence reported to condemn these 4 men, Khan's will and testament has never been shown to the public and has therefore never been scrutinised or confirmed to be real. Khan's video confession makes no actual reference to him blowing himself up. It's said by people who knew him to show him several years ago and has never been shown in its entirety. Since the narrative's release, we've also seen a video by Shahzad Tanweer. Again, Tanweer makes no reference to his suicide, and we have never seen the whole film. Even if these videos are genuine, they are not evidence that the men were responsible for the London bombings. If there is no evidence of remote detonation at the bomb sites, why did the New York police, based on what the British police had told them, report at a conference the bombs were set off using mobile phones, the same remote timing devices used in the Madrid bombings in 2004? The eyewitness accounts of the bombers fiddling with their rucksacks are extremely dubious. The first, reported widely across the international press soon after the attack, came from a Mr. Richard Jones, who claims to have seen a man fiddling with his bag on the bottom floor of the number 30 bus. He described the man he saw as clean-shaven and wearing light brown trousers and a light brown top, so obviously he wasn't talking about Hussein. The second was Danny Biddle, badly injured in the Edgware Road bomb. 6 months after the attacks, he told a newspaper that he had actually seen Khan before he blew himself up. We are not suggesting that Biddle lied, but we are suggesting that someone who is paid to tell their story 6 months after the event is not a reliable enough witness to be a central piece of evidence in the official government report concerning the attacks. As for the CCTV recordings, where are they? No CCTV footage has been released to the public. All we have seen are 3 still images. One shows Hussein alone entering the ticket hall at Luton Station, inexplicably cropped so it does not show the other 3 men who should all be around him. The second shows Hussein, again alone, outside Boots and King's Cross Station, apparently at 9 AM, 10 minutes after he was supposed to be dead, and at a time when King's Cross Station was being evacuated. And the third shows 4 figures entering Luton Station, 3 of whom have blurred faces, so only Hussein is actually identifiable. There are no images of the 4 men together in London. In fact, there are no images of any of the train bombers in London that day at all. As the police themselves emphasised, the men should have been filmed by CCTV cameras along the whole route, capturing literally thousands of images of their journey. Or perhaps, like the cameras on the number 30 bus, all those cameras just weren't working that day. The car in which they travelled to Luton is said to have contained explosive devices, but it's never been explained why the men would have left them there when embarking on a suicide mission. The devices were reportedly destroyed in controlled explosions. These photos appeared on ABC News in America, but for some reason they were never officially released in the UK. And then there is the forensic and DNA evidence apparently identifying the 4 men at the bomb sites, which again has never been presented to the public for proper scrutiny. And the fact that the police tell us that they have the evidence, and that it is convincing, unfortunately does not mean that they do, or that it is. The past record of the British police in catching and honestly convicting the real perpetrators of bombings in the UK is appalling. Instead, in numerous cases it has been shown that the police deliberately tampered with evidence, forced confessions out of suspects, and withheld information that would clear them. You think we're exaggerating? Then go on the internet and look up the following. The Birmingham 6. Guildford 4. The Maguire 7. Judith Ward. Danny McNamee. More recently, we have seen the police in action with the death of Jean de Menezes in Stockwell Station. Having killed an innocent man for no reason other than they thought he was someone else, who they also should not have killed, they responded to the outcry with a string of lies and deception. And despite all the investigations, no police officer was charged or punished in any way for the murder. And even more recently, we've seen another innocent man shot. This time as he came down the stairs in his pyjamas after his house had been raided by 250 policemen looking for chemical weapons that turned out not to be there, despite there being what the police later described as compelling evidence. So if you genuinely believed it was unlikely or even impossible that the police would ever fabricate evidence in order to give the appearance of having solved a crime, it is time to reassess your belief. They have, they do, and they will again. If we learn one thing from these incidents, it is this: the police view themselves as above the law. And if we learn another thing, it is that they are. In the wake of the bombs, Britain has been left a changed nation. Already the country with the most surveillance in the world, the UK is set to move further towards a literal Big Brother society. Tony Blair said at the 2005 Labour Party conference, "We know we need strict controls in a changing world." Really, Tony? We know we need strict controls? Exactly who do you mean by we? The British public? The government and police? Or you and your friends? And how exactly are these strict controls going to stop potential terrorists being aggrieved by our foreign policy? And how would these controls have prevented the attacks in London? We have just been fortunate enough to see these strict controls in their true light during the latest terrorist threat, which played out across the UK like an Orwellian pantomime. On the 10th of August, 24 supposed terrorists were arrested. They were allegedly just about to blow up 10 planes in mid-air using liquid explosives, despite the fact they had no bombs, no plane tickets, and several of them didn't even have passports. With the threat apparently foiled, the terrorist alert level immediately went up to critical, indicating that a terrorist attack was still deemed imminent. In response to this insanity, the airports immediately introduced an absurd draconian policy regarding carry-on luggage. No liquids could be carried onto the plane. iPods, phones and even books were banned, and mothers were made to taste their baby milk to prove it wasn't explosive. Thankfully, our Prime Minister managed to depart for his family holiday in the Caribbean before the airport clampdown occurred. As Blair also helpfully explained at the Labour conference, ID cards, traditionally resisted by the public, would be introduced. Again, because he says they are necessary in a changing world. But every one of the 4 alleged 7/7 bombers would have legally had one. So what are they hoping to achieve with them? ID cards will have the same effect on preventing terrorism as license plates have in preventing car crashes. And there's now talk of introducing biometric identification, iris scans and body scanners. Who is actually being watched here? The so-called terrorists? Or us? MI5 has boosted its numbers since the attacks by 25%. The Metropolitan Police has requested funding for an additional 1,500 anti-terrorist police, while police powers have risen considerably. These include the right to detention without trial. The UK is currently the only European nation to have suspended Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which prevents such detention. How can a supposedly free, moral and rational society allow the imprisonment of human beings without having the evidence to actually charge them with wrongdoing? What happened to the concept of innocent until proven guilty? When was it decided that this no longer applied to every one of us, irrespective of race or background? Consider the cases of the following terrorists. Walter Wolfgang, the 82-year-old pensioner removed from the Labour Party conference in September 2005 for heckling Jack Straw, and then, after he tried to gain re-entry, detained under the Terrorism Act. 80-year-old John Catt, stopped by police for wearing a t-shirt suggesting that Bush and Blair be tried for war crimes, searched under the Terrorism Act. Sally Cameron, arrested and held for 4 hours for walking on a cycle path in Dundee, under the Terrorism Act. Isabel Ellis Cockcroft, stopped and searched under the Terrorism Act, despite being 11 years old. Ian Blair said in a GMTV interview in February 2005, "I don't think people should distinguish crime and terrorism too easily." Think about those words coming from the Chief of Police. I don't think people should distinguish crime and terrorism too easily. In the most extraordinary and draconian expansion of their powers ever seen in the UK, the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act came into power in 2005. The provision you may have heard about in the media was Section 132, the restriction to demonstrate within 1 kilometre of Parliament Square, obviously an essential tool in fighting organised crime. The first conviction under the Act was in December 2005, after Maya Evans was arrested for reading out the names of British soldiers killed in the Iraq War under the cenotaph, without permission. Since when was peaceful protest a serious organised crime? But the more important section of the Act, and one that was barely mentioned by the mainstream media, was the changes made to the powers of arrest used by the police. From New Year's Day 2006, the police can now arrest you for any offence at all, including dropping litter or not wearing a seatbelt. Indeed, according to the actual wording of the Act, the police can even arrest you, quote, to enable the name of the person to be ascertained. If you don't think they would ever actually do that, ask yourself why they would include it in the Act at all, if they were never going to use it. We are constantly told that the terrorists, especially the CIA-created Islamic group Al-Qaeda, are attacking our way of life and our freedom. But these transparently absurd claims are made only by our government, never by the terrorists themselves, who consistently cite very different and very specific grievances. And ironically, it's not the terrorists attacking our way of life, but our own government. Through the expansion of police powers and stringent anti-terrorist measures being imposed upon Britain, they are using our fear for our safety to restrict our liberty, and they are using their false promises of security to erode our privacy. This is happening now, and it's happening to every person in the UK. You are not somehow exempt from the regulatory provisions of the new police state being brought into this country. The terrorists cannot take away our freedom or change our way of life. Only our own elected leaders can do that, and they are. If you have examined any of the information released about the attacks of the 7th of July, or if you get your news from a reputable source, i.e. one outside of the mainstream media, then you probably are one of those advocating an inquiry into the London bombings. We suggest you stop wasting your time. Why? Because full public inquiries are not full, and they're not public. These terms are used simply to delude us into thinking that the process of an inquiry is intended to uncover the truth about something. This is simply not the case. Let's recall the last major public inquiry held in the UK, the Hutton inquiry, set up to investigate the apparent suicide of Dr. David Kelly, with a side mandate of examining whether the government manipulated intelligence to facilitate the invasion of Iraq. Given that Hutton was appointed by Lord Faulkner, the very man who continues to declare that the Iraq invasion was somehow legal, it is unsurprising that Hutton absolved Blair and his government of blame. The inquiry refuted allegations that the government had lied about information on Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, something that any rational person doing an hour of research can see clearly that they did. And more incredulously, Hutton ruled that Dr. David Kelly committed suicide, despite all the physical and medical evidence that clearly points to him having been murdered. But it gets worse. As if public inquiries were already not pointless enough, a recent piece of legislation now guarantees that they will never be anything other than a charade. On June the 7th, 2005, exactly 1 month before the London bombings, the Inquiries Act became law. Under this new act, any inquiry will be controlled by the relevant government minister, who is empowered to block public scrutiny of state actions. This inexplicable change to the way inquiries are run was openly criticised by the Law Society of England and Amnesty International, who stated that the new act means that any inquiry will be controlled by the executive. Obviously the one thing you don't want from a supposedly unbiased investigation. The Canadian judge Peter Corey stated, "It seems to me that the proposed new act would make a meaningful inquiry impossible. The commissions would be working in an impossible situation. The minister, the actions of whose ministry was to be reviewed by the public inquiry, would have the authority to thwart the efforts of the inquiry at every step. It really creates an intolerable Alice in Wonderland situation." While the chairman of the US Joint Committee on Human Rights, Congressman Chris Smith, declared that the bill pending before the British Parliament should be named the Public Inquiries Cover-Up Bill. So if this new act makes inquiries so pointless and so easy to control, the question is why Blair, Clark and the rest of them have seemingly done their best to prevent one happening. We suggest that there will be an inquiry. It will be obstructed from the beginning, and it will be controlled by the very people it should be investigating. Be assured it will not be anything approaching a proper investigation. At no point will the inquiry even consider the possibility that the 4 men labelled as suicide bombers could possibly be innocent, or question the lack of evidence against them. It will pass on verbatim the same meaningless, unverifiable assertions made by the police and by the media's anonymous security sources. But it will avoid completely the major contradictions and problems in the official story. They hope at the end of it the public will be satisfied, and the public probably will be. So given that there's never going to be a real investigation determined to actually find rather than hide the truth, what can we do ourselves to uncover the facts? First, demand that the police release the evidence they say they've got. How? File a Freedom of Information request for the CCTV footage that they claim to have but have never released, and for the vast archive of CCTV images that they've never mentioned but must exist if the men took the journey we've been told they did. There is absolutely no reason for us not to see this CCTV footage, other than it not actually existing. Secondly, write to whatever mainstream media you read or watch and ask them why they have not addressed the verifiable mistruths that they have themselves put out about the attacks, why they have not questioned the obvious discrepancies in the narrative or the contradictions in the police's presentations of the facts, and why they appear to be actively supporting the police and the government over the British public in suppressing information whilst releasing disinformation. And thirdly, write to your Member of Parliament. Ask him if he has read the official narrative and what his views are on the obvious contradictions it contains. Then ask him, as your elected representative, to demand answers from Parliament concerning this attack on the British people. If the official story is right, if the narrative describes the events the way they actually happened, then there is no justification for the police refusing your requests. There is no reason the media would not be properly investigating the details of the official narrative, and there is no reason for your MP to be anything other than open and helpful. But at best their response to you will be polite disinterest. That's if you get a response. And the information requested, the evidence crucial for any of us to make an informed judgment about what happened that day, will not be forthcoming. Don't believe us? Try it. Ask yourself this: if 7/7 happened the way they say it did, why would there be any discrepancies? Why would there be any uncertainty about the movements of these men? Why would there be any contradictions, confusions or inconsistencies in the official story? There wouldn't be. On the contrary, there would be copious amounts of CCTV footage of the 4 men on every step of their journey. There would be numerous eyewitnesses among the victims. there would be no confusion about which train from Luton the men got on, the nature of the explosives, or the times of the explosions. If the official story describes what actually occurred, there would be nothing to doubt.
If London could survive the Blitz, it can survive 4 miserable bombers like this. Not saying there are 4 bombers, not saying there are 4 bombers, not saying there are 4 bombers, 4 miserable events like this.
A rational person reviewing the evidence presented can come to only one conclusion. We are being deceived. The nature of the deception may be uncertain, but its existence is undeniable. If changes are going to be made to our way of life on the basis of what occurred on the 7th of July 2005, and they have been, then we, the British public, are entitled to the full weight of evidence concerning these attacks. The media has an unwritten mandate to present the truth in an unbiased manner, which they have blatantly ignored. And the police, who are our public servants, and the government, who are our elected employees, are, by definition, required to provide it, whether they want to or not. This is an issue that encompasses the very nature of democracy, the basis of government, and the role of the police and the media in our society today. An objective, unbiased analysis of what occurred on the 7th of July 2005 must be made, and a rational debate about how we, as a society, are going to respond to it must be allowed to take place. We owe it to all 56 people who died that day. We owe it to their families, and we owe it to ourselves.
I thank the gentleman, the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McKinney.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I watched President Bush deliver a moving speech at the United Nations in September 2003, in which he mentioned the crisis of the sex trade. The President called for the punishment of those involved in this horrible business. But at the very moment of that speech, DynCorp was exposed for having been involved in the buying and selling of young women and children. While all of this was going on, DynCorp kept the Pentagon contract to administer the smallpox and anthrax vaccines and is now working on a plague vaccine through the Joint Vaccine Acquisition Program. Mr. Secretary, is it policy of the U.S. government to reward companies that traffic in women and little girls? That's my first question. My second question, Mr. Secretary, according to the Comptroller General of the United States, there are serious financial management problems at the Pentagon, to which Mr. Cooper alluded. Fiscal year 1999, 2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, 1.1 trillion missing. And DOD is the #1 reason why the government can't balance its checkbook. The Pentagon has claimed year after year that the reason it can't account for the money is because its computers don't communicate with each other. My second question, Mr. Secretary, is who has the contracts today to make those systems communicate with each other? How long have they had those contracts? And how much have the taxpayers paid for them? Finally, Mr. Secretary, after the last hearing, I thought that my office was promised a written response to my question regarding the 4 war games on September 11th. I have not yet received that response, but would like for you to respond to the questions that I've put to you today, and then I do expect the written response to my previous question, hopefully by the end of the week.
Thank you, Representative. The answer to your first question is no. Absolutely not. The policy of the United States government is clear, unambiguous, and opposed to the activities that you describe. The second question.
Well, how do you explain the fact that DynCorp and its successor companies have received and continue to receive government contracts?
I would have to go and find the facts, but there are laws and rules and regulations with respect to government contracts, and there are times that corporations do things they should not do, in which case they tend to be suspended for some period. There are times then that under the laws and the rules and regulations passed by the Congress and implemented by the executive branch, that corporations can get off of out of the penalty box, if you will, and be permitted to engage in contracts with the government. They're not generally not barred in perpetuity.
This contract, this company was never in the penalty box. If you could proceed to my second question, please.
The second question, I've forgotten what the second question was.
I think Ms. Jones.
Okay.
Successful demolitions require that all structural support columns collapse at virtually the same time. If they don't, or if something else goes wrong, the result will look something like this. This is World Trade Center 7 just before it collapsed on September the 11th, 2001. It had not been hit by an aircraft. It had been damaged by falling debris and fire. But by 5:20 p.m. most of the fires have been extinguished. Although the building was 47 stories high, it doesn't fall sideways, nor collapse unevenly. For this to have happened, all of the building's vertical supports must have given way at almost exactly the same time. Yet the Federal Emergency Management Agency reported that the collapse was due primarily to fire. But what does it look like to you? The National Institute of Standards and Technology still rules out a controlled demolition. So the question is, do you believe what you can see with your own eyes, or do you believe what you are told?
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
I am too.
And
please tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but eyewitnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers, and some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel. And physics professor analyzed some of the steel, and Stephen Jones, and he found evidence of thermate residue which would explain how the buildings collapsed by means of pre-planted explosives. So, have you analyzed the steel for any of those residues?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
The fires got very intense down there, and it actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And almost like a chunk of lava from Kilauea or Iceland, where they're very sharp but breakable shards on the end here.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically you'd have buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel. And you just couldn't imagine the force that took. Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
There was even a point where you would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires on the ground. It would ignite cars and cars would just blow up. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color. See that stuff he's pulling out? What was that, Chief? We're gonna hold off on the water. See the stuff he's pulling out? Yeah. It's red hot. If we hit it too much steam, you won't be able to see what he's doing. Great.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. Every now and then, one of the pieces of equipment will dig in, they'll open up a small area, the oxygen will rush in, and you'll get this plume of brown, black smoke coming up. That's because that fire just got more oxygen. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall from Building 6.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
And all of a sudden, he comes out of this little tunnel screaming, "Wait till you see what I found." And he pulls in ministers and officials, and there, this cross is fully extended, melted together with the intense heat. The two beams were never initially part of the same structure. Heat literally melted them together. And the piece of metal that's draped over was molten metal that had literally fallen over one of the arms.
Steel-toed boots is one of the biggest things.
Steel-toed boots?
Steel-toed boots. Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
It was literally steaming. Your boots would melt in certain areas. That's how hot it was. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks at least.
Go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it. I was on the site, I was on the steel yards, so I don't know that that's so.
There's a video of it.
Melted around 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it's probably pretty difficult to get that kind of temperatures in a fire. So I don't know the basis. I can't address your question if I don't know the basis.
Well, NASA pictures, thermal images showed those sorts of temperatures in the basement.
Would you send them to me?
Okay.
My name is Mark, and I'm the individual who was questioning Dr. Gross
and he asked me to email to him those thermal images. When I approached him after his talk to get his email address for that purpose, he refused to provide it to me. I think this is important because it reveals the attitude of the NIST investigators, which is one of willful ignorance of what really happened on 9/11.
February 27th, 1933. At 9:27 p.m., a massive fire erupts inside the Reichstag, Germany's House of Parliament. Marinus van der Lubbe, a 24-year-old half-blind Dutch communist, is found half-naked behind the building and arrested on sight. After an interrogation and trial, Marinus is beheaded 3 days before his 25th birthday. Historians argue that Gestapo police entered the Reichstag through an underground tunnel and soaked the building with chemicals and gasoline, with Marinus van der Lubbe arriving later to start the fire with his shirt. Later that evening, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring meet in front of the flaming debris to round up a list of communists and execute them that same night. The next day, Hitler passed the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended most civil liberties and banned publications considered unfriendly to the Nazi cause. Hitler then takes Nazi control of the German parliament, passes the enabling acts, and begins his invasion of neighboring countries, starting with Poland. September 11th, 1941. Ground is broken at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and construction begins. December 7th, 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy attacks the Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii. 2,403 Americans are killed, and an additional 1,178 are wounded. Although Roosevelt received multiple warnings indicating that an attack was imminent, he withholds this information and informs his commanders that negotiations with Japan are underway.
The Pearl Harbor Investigating Committee hears the testimony of Admiral Kimmel, who was Navy head at Pearl Harbor at the time of the Jap sneak attack.
We needed one thing. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
A number of government investigations concluded that there was considerable foreknowledge of the Japanese plans. Roosevelt declares December 7th an unprovoked and dastardly attack, an act of war between the United States and Japanese Empire, and asks for carte blanche to enter World War II. May 8th, 1945. Nazi Germany formally surrenders to the World War II Allied forces. Beginning that month, the United States military begins recruiting the top rocket scientists from Nazi Germany. The project, known as Operation Paperclip, eventually included more than 100 individuals for the purpose of advancing America's technology. July 16th, 1945. The Manhattan Project, a joint effort between the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada to develop strategic nuclear weapons, culminates with a detonation in New Mexico, nicknamed the Trinity Test. The detonation was equal to 19 kilotons of TNT and left a crater of radioactive glass 10 feet deep and 1,000 feet wide. A variation of this bomb would later be used on 2 cities. Hiroshima, Japan. 70,000 people are instantly killed as a result. The bomb completely obliterated 1 square mile and started fires across almost 5 square miles, leaving almost nothing at the epicenter. 75% of the city was either heavily damaged or destroyed, and approximately 100,000 people died from radiation poisoning in the years that followed. Nagasaki, Japan. 40,000 are killed and almost 30,000 are injured. The bomb destroyed 1 square mile and started fires almost 2 miles out. In the end, the Manhattan Project cost nearly $2 billion and employed more than 130,000 people at 3 different facilities across 3 different states. Research and design at Los Alamos National Laboratory and 2 sites built explicitly for the project. Uranium enrichment at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and plutonium enrichment at the Hanford site in Washington State. At the time, it was the largest construction effort in United States history, and the entire operation was supervised by General Leslie Groves of the Army Corps of Engineers. Groves used a practice known as compartmentalization, which limits intelligence to a need-to-know basis and often leaves those working on the project in the dark. Entire communities and natives were literally packed up and moved out. Although tens of thousands of people were directly affected, the Manhattan Project was kept a secret. So secret that Vice President Harry Truman only became aware of it after President Roosevelt's death. General Groves himself claimed, "Compartmentalization of knowledge was the very heart of security. Each man should know everything he needed to know and do his job, and nothing else." To this day, much of the Manhattan Project remains classified. November 21st, 1945. The Nuremberg trials, an international tribunal to convict the Nazi Party of war crimes, commences in Germany. 12 are executed. The rest are imprisoned, acquitted, or commit suicide before trial.
And here is the presidential jet, U.S. Air Force number 1, printed on the side, and the crowd begins its cheer, which you can't hear.
The now turning on to Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the trademark. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please.
The President of the United States is dead.
Swear that I will faithfully execute.
I will faithfully execute.
August 4th, 1964. 2 American ships report that they are being attacked by North Vietnamese military units in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. President Lyndon Baines Johnson immediately declares it an unprovoked attack and orders retaliatory strikes against North Vietnam asking Congress to authorize action in Southeast Asia. Believing Johnson's claims, legislators act quickly, giving him carte blanche to use military forces in Vietnam. However, documents declassified from the National Security Agency in 2005 confirm that the attack never took place. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution was signed by President Johnson on August 10, 1964. This decree was the doorway through which the United States officially walked into Vietnam.
In March 1968, while on a not very routine mission, a very hard, bitterly fought search and destroy mission in a free fire zone of South Vietnam, a place called Pinkville near Quang Ngai in the northern part of Vietnam, the Army says that a platoon led by First Lieutenant William L. Calley Jr., a 26-year-old combat veteran, the Army claims that they murdered 109 Vietnamese villagers, mostly women and children. Kelly doesn't necessarily dispute that fact. What he says is, I was following orders.
September 2000. The Project for a New American Century, a neoconservative think tank whose members include Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and Jeb Bush, releases their report entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses. The report calls for a massive overhaul of the United States military and encourages fighting and winning multiple theater wars. They declare that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
I have a master's degree in counseling psychology from the University of Colorado, and I've been practicing reevaluation counseling for over 16 years. If we can think of our worldview as being sort of our mental and emotional home, I think all of us will do just about anything to defend our homes, to defend our families, and so I see that with people, and I saw that with myself when my brother tried to talk with me about it, of don't mess with me, don't mess with my home, don't mess with my comfort with how things are. And about a week later, I read a lengthy article by Professor Griffin about why he believes the official account of 9/11 cannot be true. And it was a very well-researched article. I was in my office at the time. I sat there and I felt my stomach churning. I thought maybe I was going to be sick. And I leaped out of my chair and ran out the door and took a long walk around the block, around several blocks, and just broke down. I understand now that what was happening was my worldview about my government being in some way my protector, almost like a parent, had been dashed, and it was like being cast out into the wilderness, I think is the closest way to describe that feeling. And I sobbed, felt like the ground had completely disappeared beneath my feet, and I knew at some point during the walk that I knew that I was going to have to become active in educating other people about this, that for me to retain any sense of integrity, I was going to have to take some action. I couldn't just let something like...
I'm David Ray Griffin. I taught philosophy of religion and theology at the Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University. I published about 35 books in my field, but then starting in 2004, I started publishing about 9/11, and since that time I have published 10 books about 9/11. You have empirical people who will simply say, look at the evidence, and if it's convincing, I will change my mind. Other people are paradigmatic people. They have a paradigm. They say, this is the way the world works, and I'm convinced this is the right way the world works. 9/11 doesn't fit into that paradigm. So I don't need to look at the evidence. It's paradigmatic. And then there is a third type of person that we often call wishful thinkers. I call it wishful and fearful thinking. So they simply will not believe something that they fear to be the truth. And I found that maybe to be the most powerful factor of people rejecting 9/11 truth and not even entertaining.
If we imagine the kind of world we would face if the people who bombed the West Hall in Mosul, or the people who did the bombing in Spain, or the people who attacked the United States in New York, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania and attacked the Pentagon, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania and attacked the Pentagon.
I was looking at the Evan Fairbanks footage, which is kind of bluish, and it's from the underneath. It's off-centered on the fuselage. It's between the engines. It casts its own shadow. It has its own reflection. And when I saw this, I thought somebody's had to have photoshopped this, and I wanted to get other sources to make sure that it wasn't just a product of Photoshop. It was in all the CNN footage when you took their videos and did freeze frames. It was definitely a three-dimensional piece of equipment. It definitely has nothing to do with Photoshop, and it shouldn't be there.
Anybody can see the other piece of equipment right there in the center line on the starboard side of that fuselage. It can't be anything other than an external piece of equipment.
A lot of the photographs and a lot of video regarding Flight 175, and there's some CNN footage that shows the whole side of the plane lighting up. And just as the aircraft is penetrating the World Trade Center, there's this bright anomalous event. It's like an orange flash, off to the right of the fuselage.
The bottom of that aircraft was exposed so that there was a large flash just prior to impact with the building. There was a large flash, so large that it lit up the side of the fuselage of that aircraft. It wasn't just a small spark.
There's been some discussion of just exactly what produced this flash. Some of the scenarios have been talked about have been reflection, or sparks, or static discharge, or possibly an incendiary attached to the aircraft. This flash is produced in the shadow of the wing, so I don't think it could have been a reflection. As far as the possibility of sparks during penetration, the radome of the aircraft is a composite material. It's not metal per se. The wings are metal. They didn't produce sparks as they penetrated. So I don't believe they were sparks. As far as the static discharge, the 767, all aircraft have attached to the airframe what's called static wicks that are there to dissipate any static charges that could be produced on an aircraft in flight. In all my years of flying, the only time an aircraft has been statically charged is when you're flying for extended periods in precipitation. September the 11th was a perfectly clear early fall day without any clouds in the sky, so I don't think these aircraft would have been statically charged by precipitation. And the other item, or possible explanation, would have been an incendiary. And I do believe that this is what the source of the flash was. This flash is produced right in line where the pod was attached. Look at the footage in very slow motion. You can step through the footage with your pause still button on a DVD, and as this aircraft penetrates, you see the enlarged torn area, facade where this pod was attached. All this evidence indicates to me that it was not a reflection or sparks or static discharge, but I think it was an incendiary that was associated with the pod that was attached.
Well, the pod could have been a number of things. It could have been even a missile attached. It could have been some kind of explosive attached. But whatever it was, it didn't belong there on a commercial flight.
This is a rocket pod. We primarily use these to shoot 2.75-inch unguided rockets. On the A-10, the primary role that we use these rockets for is forward air control. We shoot white phosphorus rockets that contain a phosphorus spotting charge. A very brilliant white cloud of smoke comes up when the rocket hits.
American Flight 11 was the flight that hit the North Tower, the first tower that was hit. And as far as we know, it was recorded by just one source, and that was the Nade brothers, who were producing a documentary video about New York firefighters. They happened to be in a position to catch American Flight 11 as it overflew New York City and flew into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Again, as you look at this footage, slow it down just a little bit, you can see this a big flash. This is before this airplane even hits the North Tower, and I would say quite probably that it was also an incendiary that caused that flash.
Pods under the plane suggesting they might be some sort of military plane, and flashes suggesting that they might be igniting large fireballs for spectacular television effect. Personally, I'm not convinced that that's true, but I'm also I'm not convinced that we need to dismiss that hypothesis. I've looked at these images, and some of the pod images, I think, they don't look to me like just optical illusions, like the people who've debunked this claim.
Did the pod have anything to do with the flash? I can't answer it, but I can say this. The pod you will not find, or an external piece of equipment that large, you will not find on the belly or attached anywhere on the external part of a Part 121 scheduled airliner in the United States. It just won't happen. All that does is tell me that airplane was not the airplane that the government said it was.
As unanimously demonstrated by the witnesses, the plane was nowhere near the 5 down light poles. But it was furthest from light pole number 1, which is what cab driver Lloyd England claims he lifted out of the windshield of his cab minutes after the attack. Lloyd was confronted with this information in June of 2008 and had a very odd reaction. Before the on-camera interview began, unaware he was being audio recorded, Lloyd let it slip that he knew his cab and the light pole were on the bridge.
One guy took pictures. He lives right over 17th Street.
He took pictures of the event?
And he was up on the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
He was up on the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
He was up on the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
He took pictures of the pole.
Oh, the pole, right.
He took pictures of the car.
Right.
And as far as I know, he still has them.
But when the camera started, Lloyd said the complete opposite and refused to admit he was anywhere near the bridge.
Here's what's going on, Lloyd. We've talked to dozens of people, like I said.
No problem.
Most of them saw the plane for a big long time coming.
Right.
All these guys, they were at Arlington Cemetery right here in the maintenance buildings.
Mm-hmm.
We talked to all the people who were at the Sitco station right here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your car on the road, on the side of the road, in this picture, was right here.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, we got pictures of it. Here it is.
My car is not there.
No, we got pictures of it.
No, my car was not there.
I can pull it up. I'll show you.
I don't care what you do. My car was at the Pentagon. My car was not across this bridge. He took pictures of the car. He was up on the bridge.
This picture right here, here you are, you see? The car's kind of surrounded by these guys. There's the pole right here.
Okay.
Now see what this is? That's the cobblestone from the bridge. Now take a look at this. Come over here. Here's the bridge right here. Now there's your cab. It's sideways on the side of the road. With the hole in it, the pole's laying down right over there. The pole used to be up right here. This is pole number 1. Well, you're right on the bridge.
No.
That's your cab, right? Look close. See that?
Facing the wrong way.
No, it's facing the same way. Facing the same way it was right here. This is taken from the other side. This way it's facing. Look at that one.
I've never seen that picture there.
You never saw it? This is Jason Ingersoll. He was a Navy military photographer. Here's your cab, right?
That's not.
See your cab? See it? There's the grill. You see you right here. You're wearing the cap.
Yeah, I see it. I see it.
All right. Now there's the pole. That's your pole. See the bend?
Yeah.
That's the pole you pulled out, right? There's your cab. I mean, it couldn't be any other pole. The lamp is down next to it. But see how it's got the cobblestone?
I see the sign.
That's the sign.
But that's not.
And that's the cobblestone.
That's not.
From the bridge.
I see that from the bridge, but that's not where it happened.
Well, how come? It's not where it happened. Well, how did they get there then?
I can't explain that.
You can't explain it?
I can't explain it.
Lloyd continued to refuse to admit that the photographs prove where he was located. This is because he knew we had proof the plane was on the north side and did not hit the light poles. He was trying to maintain a position of plausible deniability.
I did not come around that way. Not down at this bridge. And he took pictures. He was up on the bridge.
Even the picture your friend Mike just showed us.
I can see.
You see that, right?
I can see.
How can that be?
Well, I'm only telling you what happened.
You're telling us something that's completely different from the picture.
Tell us what happened.
I have no problem with that.
Okay, we're on the north side again. You're saying, where were you?
I'm saying that
you weren't even
where these signs are right here.
Were these signs right here?
Right here. These signs right here where I was at.
Before them, north of them.
No, this is where the pictures were taken.
No, they weren't. There's no cobblestone there.
Well, I'm telling you, that's where I was.
There's no cobblestone.
That's where I was.
This is the signs that you see in the images.
I understand that, but that's where I was.
These are the images. The VDOT pole, the VDOT camera pole, all of that. The cobblestone, look at the cobblestone bridge. That's you. You're standing right next to it. See that?
I have no problem with that. I was not down here.
See the cobblestone?
I was not here.
That's where you were.
I was not here.
Lloyd was much more candid when he didn't realize he was being recorded.
This is too big for me, man. This is a big thing. Man, you know, this is a world thing happening. I'm a small man. You know,
right.
My lifestyle is completely different from this.
Right.
I'm not supposed to be involved in this. This is for other people who have money and all this kind of stuff.
But you said, wait, what do you mean?
Well, I'm not supposed to be involved in this. I don't have nothing.
So is your point that these people that have all the money,
this is their thing.
This is their event.
This is for them.
Meaning they're doing it for their own reasons.
That's right. I'm not supposed to be in it.
But they used you, right?
I'm in it.
You're in it.
Yeah, we came across the highway together.
You and their event.
That's right.
But they must have planned that.
It was planned. One thing thing about it, you got to understand something. When people do things and get away with it, you, eventually it's going to come to me. And when it comes to me, it's going to be so big I can't do nothing about it. And when it comes to me, it's going to be so big I can't do nothing about it. And when it comes to me, it's going to be so big I can't do nothing about it. So it has to be stopped in the beginning when it's small to keep it from spreading.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Lloyd, in essence, admitted his involvement in the 9/11 black operation, but he was cautious not to outright confess. He worked hard to distance himself from the planners, while admitting it was planned. Regardless of Lloyd's true level of involvement, the independent evidence for a north side approach proves the cab and light pole scene staged, and that the plane did not hit the Pentagon.
I am Major General Albert Stubblebine. I am retired Army Major General. In my last assignment, my last command, I was responsible for all of the Army's strategic intelligence forces around the world. I had responsibility for the signals intelligence, photo intelligence, counterintelligence, human intelligence. They all belong to me in my last assignment. I don't know exactly what hit it, but I do know from the photographs that I have analyzed and looked at very, very carefully, it was not an airplane.
Actually, it was Bob Franken with an eyewitness who said it appeared that that Boeing 757, the American Airlines jet, landed short of the Pentagon. Can you give us any better idea of how much of the plane actually impacted the building?
You know, it might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual side of the building that's crashed in, and as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon and then caused the side to collapse. Now, even though if you look at the pictures of the Pentagon, you see that the floors have all collapsed, that didn't happen immediately. It wasn't until almost about 45 minutes later.
On September 11, 2001, I had returned back from maternity leave. I had to get Elijah situated in daycare. I walked into the building. I had to clear Elijah to go to the area. There were some things that they wanted me to take care of prior to me taking him to the daycare. I sat down at the computer to actually turn the computer on. As soon as I pressed the button, boom. So at that particular time, based off what happened, I thought I had triggered a bomb. I was covered from my neck all the way down to my back in debris. My son was completely blown out of his stroller, and some of the floors had collapsed within, and people were trapped in between the floors. My son had stopped crying, so I felt strength out of nowhere to actually low crawl from out under the debris to try to find my son. But because there were so many people in that area, whether they were screaming or crying or saying help me, save me, I felt pretty much divided. I didn't know if to help them first or to try to find my son. But I had tried to lift some of the debris to find my son, and I wasn't able to locate him, so I helped the other people with the thought that they would help me find my son. But due to all the hysteria, they just wanted to get out. There was an area where there was a pack of debris. We climbed over it, and in one last effort, I had reached down while there were two people holding my arm. I had reached down under a pack of debris and pulled my son up by his onesie, which is a t-shirt that snapped in between a child's leg. I put him over my shoulder and proceeded to get out of that particular location that had collapsed. And I came out in what is believed to be the entrance or the place of initial impact, and was placed on the lawn that was closest to the highway prior to be transported to the hospital on that particular day. While I was coming out of the Pentagon, I didn't see any evidence of metal, airplane seats, luggage, nothing that would give me any indication that it was a plane that had hit the building. I lost one shoe, so I was walking through the area barefooted. So I was particularly careful to try to make sure I did not step on anything sharp while I had my son on my shoulder. I did not have jet fuel over my body. My son didn't have jet fuel over his body. The people that I helped didn't have jet fuel on their body. So again, there was nothing on the inside that would give me any indication that there was a plane on that particular day that hit the building. Most of the people that were in the area where I was located, and again, I did ask because maybe I was off of my judgment, but in speaking with everyone, it was conclusive that no one else in the area where I was located had seen any parts of planes or luggage or baggage or anything of that nature. Yes, I believe it's something part of much more sinister, and that's why my goal is to try to push for a federal grand jury so that people can be brought forth for perjury and obstruction of justice. I mean, when you go out of your way to fabricate an official story, when obviously the evidence that appears, whether it's footage or the work that many people have done, shows that the official story couldn't possibly be true, then yes, you should be brought to justice. And when people can come together and feel like they can utilize, human beings as lambs to a slaughter, yes, that's what's unpatriotic, that's what's un-American. When we'll turn our own people to sacrifice them for whatever their motive may be, regardless that their motive is of no significance, but the fact that they would use, innocent human beings as lambs to a slaughter to perpetrate whatever it is their cause or motive is. Yes, they should be brought to justice, and it's obvious that the official story is, it has been fabricated pretty much.
If you are among those to whom it seems impossible that the authorities would actually allow 9/11 to happen for political gain at such an enormous cost to human life, consider what the authorities knowingly allowed to happen to the residents of this city immediately after September 11th. Let me please introduce Jenna Orkin of the World Trade Center Environmental Organization. Jenna.
September 11th was a tragedy that has changed the course of history and the way we live. It was also an environmental disaster of historic proportions. The World Trade Center contained about 50,000 computers, each made with between 4 and 12 pounds of lead. That's not including World Trade Center 7. Hundreds of tons of asbestos coated the first 40 stories of at least one tower. The tens of thousands of fluorescent light bulbs each contained enough mercury to contaminate a quarter of a city block. The smoke detectors contained radioactive americium-241. The alkalinity of the air particles was equivalent to that of Drano. A month after the disaster, scientists from the University of California at Davis found levels of vanadium and very and ultrafine particles that were the highest they'd ever seen of 7,000 samples taken from around the world, including at the burning Kuwaiti oil fields. Dr. Marjorie Clark has testified that 9/11 was equivalent to dozens of asbestos factories, incinerators, and crematoria, as well as a volcano. Yet starting on September 13th, the EPA maintained the air is safe to breathe. A report by the EPA Inspector General in August of '03 revealed that EPA's press releases, which initially warned the public about asbestos in the air, were edited to offer reassurances instead. The editing was performed by the White House Council on Environmental Quality in order to reopen Wall Street. That's in the report. As a result of the false good news, rescue workers were sometimes not allowed to wear respirators on the grounds that they might frighten the public. Insurance companies often refused to pay for cleanup, forcing residents to clean the tons of toxic debris in their apartments, as per the instructions from the New York City Department of Health. Use a wet mop or wet rag, and where the dust is really bad, wear long pants. We are beginning to see the consequences of this disastrous chain of events. Over half of the heroes who cleaned Ground Zero are already manifesting serious respiratory problems. Hundreds of firefighters can no longer work, and as a harbinger of what's in store for people, 14 rescue dogs have died. The Commission report deals with this issue in a footnote on page 555. They interviewed Sam Thernstrom, the White House coordinator who changed the press releases. He said his motive wasn't to reopen Wall Street, it was procedural. His story is corroborated by Christy Todd Whitman, who told the initial lies. When John Gotti is corroborated by Lucky Luciano, that may be good enough for the Commission. We should not rest there.
Involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
A Pakistani-born American has been arrested for carrying out surveillance on the Washington, D.C. underground as part of a suspected terror plot. Rooke Ahmed is accused of working with people he believed were members of Al-Qaeda, but who were actually U.S. agents. A U.S. counterterrorism official said there's no indication Ahmed was ever in touch with real militants. And RT's Marina Portnaya found out the FBI is increasingly using tactics that critics say amount to entrapment.
May 2009.
According to the FBI, the 4 men intended to carry out their plan today.
4 African-American Muslims are arrested.
What do you have to say, sir?
Paraded in front of New York news cameras, presented as the faces of homegrown terrorism.
4 individuals that sought to bomb Jewish facilities here in the Bronx and also take down a military aircraft in Newburgh.
A terrifying plot the FBI claims to have thwarted. The suspects, quickly dubbed the Newburgh 4, are poor, illiterate ex-convicts with neither passports nor licenses.
No direction by a foreign entity or terrorist group.
Instead, direction came from Shahid Hussain, a Pakistani immigrant on the FBI payroll, reportedly paid nearly $100,000 for his services.
FBI operatives provided the fake C4 and actually showed them a fake Stinger missile.
Fake weapons and a manufactured terror plot. According to court testimony, Hussein recruited the economically strapped defendants by offering cars and cash to carry out the orchestrated operation. Then the agent provocateur testified as the government's key witness.
In post 9/11 America, the FBI has upped its ante against terrorism, allegedly foiling plots across the country. The question is, would there be any plots to foil without government informants in place to help create them? Despite surprisingly little criticism from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, others have expressed alarm over what they term entrapment, a practice considered unacceptable in countries all throughout Europe.
No, I don't think it is. I know it is. This is entrapment.
Alicia McWilliams McCullum is the aunt of 29-year-old David Williams, one of the Newburgh Four. She says her nephew is languishing behind bars for a fake terror attack grown in the home of the U.S. government.
They are creating scenarios. They are manufacturing crimes that would not have occurred if you had not planted an unconstructive seed into a community.
Bin Laden is still out there. There are real terrorists out there that we should be concerned about, and they should use those resources to find those individuals and not sit back and rely on informants to make up crime.
Well, these were all people that we began to identify.
Attorney Steve Downs, who tracks cases like the Newburgh Four, argues the U.S. government is systematically employing preemptive prosecution, targeting those whom officials deem predisposed to committing crimes before an actual crime is committed.
They're taking some really down and out, rather vulnerable individuals and not only implanting the ideology of jihad on them, giving them all the things that they need, all of the material, setting up the plan, doing all the research, everything else, and then grabbing them and then claiming that these were homegrown terrorists. It's just a fiction.
Downs created this 10-foot wide visual listing the names of individuals he believes were entrapped by the FBI.
Government decides that for some reason your ideology is causes them concern, because then they can come after you and they can manufacture crimes against you and they can make up a whole case and put you through a whole thing, and eventually if they can persuade a jury that this manufactured case is valid, you can go away to jail for a very long time.
A guilty verdict for all four men.
As is the case of David Williams and the other three who now face life in prison.
I don't have slave owners. I got government owners. Government that will sell a family off a political game. And this is a goddamn shame. That's what I'm sad to be a goddamn American today.
Marina Portnaya, RT, New York.
And joining me now for more is Alicia McWilliams McCullum. She's the aunt of David Williams, who just saw in that story of the Newburgh Four, who was sentenced today. I want to know, what is your reaction to this sentence?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, thanks for being on.
Okay, thank you. I feel like this is a miscarriage of justice that was handed down by our government.
You do.
And this is a very sad day.
Very sad day. Now, I want to know how you feel. Our reporter that was there today, paraphrasing the judge, said essentially the judge felt forced to sentence these men and that believes there was gross government misconduct exercise, and she doubts the defendants had any idea what a Stinger missile even was. How do you feel about this injustice that you just said now that you have this information? That the judge actually said this.
I've been fighting this case for 2 years, and this is what we've been saying for 2 years. You can't go in an impoverished community. We know that they didn't know what a Stinger missile was or what C4 was. We know that the government used ex-offenders to manufacture a plot. So for the judge to say that and not do anything, that's what I have a problem with. I'm like, who holds the government accountable for their unjust deeds? You can keep saying what's wrong with these cases, but then if you don't do anything and you plant flat, said it today and you said it March 24th, we know it's government misconduct.
So do you think anything's going to change? Do you have any sense that anything could right what you see as this wrong?
We have to just keep speaking out. We have to stand up, keep speaking out, and stand. You know, like the community needs to come out like Egypt. I was so proud when Egypt took that stand against their community. What we see today, no one comes out. Not no council members speak out. Everybody wants to be so silent on these cases. Why not even our government, not even our president.
Why do you think that is? who stands to gain from not speaking out
Fear,
about
the fear
this?
factor. When you use the word terrorism, you're creating that fear among a community. You're going after a community for one. You're going after a Jewish community, and then you're using Muslims. You're using Muslims and religion. So when you see fear in the word terrorism alone, people will not come out and stand up and fight. But as a family member, you're going to stand up and fight for your loved ones. You know, everything I've been fighting for this whole 2 years has been done on love and from the heart. And see, that heart is a muscle that keeps on pumping and keeps on fighting. I'm not going to be feared by our government. I am an American citizen. So I'm going to let my government pump fear into my heart when I know that this crime is manufactured by our own government, and you use not only David, but you put this whole family in a political game called war, your own American people. Where's the justice in that?
Yet we heard the prosecutors today, according to our reporter there, say that these men were ticking time bombs who needed to be taken off the streets for good. Are they ticking time bombs, and would they have ticked at all without the involvement of the government?
Since post 9/11, our government has been ticking time bombs. So they need to take that phrase and rephrase it to themselves. These cases would not be happening without our government. That's the only ticking time bomb that I see. Because if you had not planting that informant in that community and wasting all that money and resource to create a crime to justify your war, and the money you're getting from Homeland Security, some of us know what you're doing.
Now I want to ask.
No, our government at this point is a ticking time bomb.
Okay, and I want to ask you just quickly. I want to keep this discussion going for one more minute. We just saw a story where the Casey Anthony case has really captivated the nation. One girl, one criminal case, near wall-to-wall coverage on cable news. The new Borg 4 not getting the same attention. Why do you think that is, and what do you think is wrong with those priorities?
This government right now is dysfunctional. Right now I see our government is so broken and have lost its morals and integrity. Of course you don't want the truth to come out. Nobody wants the truth. And this is just showing you where their priorities is at. Ours is right outside that courthouse. We was out there today on the injustice that was being handed down by the Newburgh 4. We just watched our government make an informant above the law. Right here on American soil, who crimes overseas all for men's.
We want to know what your T-shirt says. What T-shirt are you wearing?
My T-shirt says, FBI, I am a firm believer in Jesus. And I wanted them to see that. See, my FBI is different from theirs. So my faith has been keeping me going for the past 2 years. And that's what's going to keep me going in the next few years fighting this case, to make sure that this case doesn't happen to no other people in our communities. You cannot send informants in impoverished communities and set people up, and you want to get them life and you want to justify your crimes, your war crimes, and expect us to be silenced and not say anything.
All right.
This is a miscarriage of justice.
Your fight continues after the sentencing of these men, and we'll have to see where it goes. But we certainly thank you for coming in and sharing the saga with us and your point of view. That was Alicia McWilliams-McCollum, the aunt of David Williams, member of the Newburgh 4, sentenced today.
I'm Richard D. Hall. This week's guest is an ex-principal intelligence analyst from South Yorkshire Police. In 2010, having learned about the possible involvement by authorities in both 9/11 and 7/7 terrorist attacks, whilst compiling the annual strategic threat assessment for South Yorkshire Police, he alerted senior management to a major problem on the strategic threat from terrorism, that being the threat of an internal tyranny, which far exceeded the threat from any other source, such as Islamic terrorism or the Irish Dissident Republic. These views eventually led to his dismissal. He is Tony Farrell, and he joins me today to talk about his emerging story. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Richard.
And thank you for coming on board. Now, Tony,
one of my major assignments, happily not anticipating any problem. However, I have interests in my home study in geopolitical events and the history of the church. And in looking at that, I came across information on the New World Order. I didn't like the looks of, and researched more into that just as an interest, outside interest. But it was at that point, shortly before the assignment was due, that I came across, without looking really for it, information on 9/11 which was so utterly compelling,
Yes.
or damning, about the actual official narrative. And using my analytical skills, it wasn't difficult to balance one against the other. And I came to the belief and conclusion that 9/11 was a massive inside job false flag attack. And that clearly posed me a problem with completing one component part of the strategic threat assessment, which was the terrorism aspect.
You report to directly, Tony, first.
I reported, my relationship was most closely with the Director of Intelligence, and I had a line management responsibility to do a check to Detective Chief Inspector for day-to-day reporting. Right. But for the strategic work, it was always for the Director of Intelligence.
And where would the Director of Intelligence be based at?
He would be based in headquarters of South Yorkshire Police, right, in the Specialist Crime Services.
Right. So you thought, look, I want to mention the threat of internal tyranny in my report because you believed that this was the bigger threat.
Well, the first thing I needed to do, I felt obliged to do, is, given my beliefs, formulated by my own home study that ran horribly contradictory to the government narrative, the first thing I felt compelled to do was to alert management to that predicament that I was in. That I know, as the analyst tasked to do the threat assessment, be complicit in what I now believe to be a lie.
Right.
I felt sick as I was going through my work, because all of a sudden I'd had that paradigm shift, whereby I could not, in my conscience, go along with this. But my managers didn't seem at all concerned. They just wanted that product delivered for the Intelligence Strategy Board and business could carry on as normal. They didn't want me to alert them to this issue, or that's how it appeared. And for the one day and one day only, that was the 7th of July.
Last year, 2010.
I went along with that, and I was all prepared to deliver on the 8th of July, the full strategic assessment in accordance with what they want. Right. But in my mind, it would have to go along with go with the lie. When I went home on the evening of the 7th of 7, a defining moment, my valley of decision came to me that evening.
Right.
And I knew, conscience-wise, with the faith I have, I could not, in all honesty, go in and hand over my assignment, because to my mind that would have made me complicit in the monstrous tyranny that had occurred in 9/11 and 7/7, because I would have been supporting the lie knowingly, given what I was now convinced was a monstrous lie, and conscience would not allow me to do it.
liberties groups, the brainchild of Senators John McCain and Joe Lieberman. The bill would give the U.S. government the power to indefinitely detain terror suspects without charge or trial and to interrogate them for their quote-unquote intelligence value.
The plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
That was not American Airlines! That was not American Airlines!
Detonated.
Plans to take down a building.
All the way down.
It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
Mark, if what you say is true, those could be cargo planes or something like that. You said you didn't see any windows in the side?
I didn't see any windows on the sides. I saw the plane flying low. I was probably like a block away from the subway in Brooklyn, and that plane came down very low.
I mean, it was like a cruise missile with wings. Went right there and slammed right into the Pentagon. Huge explosion, great ball of fire.
The plane does not fit.
The splash is produced right in line where the pod was attached. Look at the footage in very slow motion. You can step through the footage with your pause still button on a DVD, and as this aircraft penetrates, you see the enlarged, torn area facade where this pod was attached.
Why are you and the Vice President insisting on appearing together before the 9/11 Commission?
Because the 9/11 Commission wants to ask us questions. That's why we're meeting, and I look forward to meeting with them and answering their questions.
Why you're appearing together rather than separately, which was their request?
Because it's a good chance for both of us to answer questions that the 9/11 Commission is looking forward to asking us, and I'm looking forward to answering them. Let's see.
About there, 1 o'clock.
Once you get on, just open up. I see you. Light them all up. 002 traffic, 260. Come on, fire. Hey, Roger. Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
It's a mystery to me. The game commences for the usual fee, plus expenses, confidential information. It's in a diary. my investigation. It's not a public inquiry. I go checking out the reports, digging up the dirt. You get to meet all sorts in this line of work. Treachery and treason, there's always an excuse for it. And when I find the reason, I still can't get used to it. And what have you got? At the end of the day, what do you got? Take away a bottle of whiskey and a new set of lies.